From a 1,940 seconds camera flash to a $3.6 million auction record, Darth Vader's Crimson Blade hides secrets stranger than any Force vision. The iconic weapon was built from scrap metal, animated by a Korean immigrant, uncredited for decades, and wielded by a secret stuntman, while the world thought it was someone else entirely. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Darth Vader's lightsaber. Fact 1. Built from 1,940 seconds British camera flash parts. When the prop team for Star Wars needed to create Darth Vader's iconic lightsaber back in 1977, they didn't have the luxury of computer-aided design or custom fabrication, so they had to get creative with whatever they could find lying around. What they ended up using was a vintage MPP microflash, which was a 3-cell flash attachment that photographers used on British press cameras way back in the 1940s. This bulky metal cylinder, originally designed to help newspaper photographers capture images in dark conditions, became the foundation for one of cinema's most recognizable weapons. The prop builders took this old camera flash and started adding pieces to make it look more futuristic and menacing, gluing hard plastic track from sliding cabinet doors onto the cylinder to create those distinctive ribbed grips that Vader holds in the film. If you've ever seen those tracks on glass display cabinets that let the doors slide open and closed, that's exactly what they used, and for years people mistakenly thought these grips were made from old car windshield wiper blades. To complete the look, they fashioned the switch plate from the LED display of a 1974 calculator, adding that technological feel that made it seem like advanced alien technology. The MPP microflash was manufactured by Micro Precision Products of England, and the prop team even removed the original microflash nameplate from the side by drilling out the tiny rivets that held it in place. They also had to modify the clamp mechanism, inserting a large flathead nail where the threaded rod would normally go and bending it to keep everything secure, then gluing the original clamp lever onto the end to maintain the authentic look of the vintage flash unit. Fact 2. The original props were insanely fragile. The very first lightsaber props created for the original Star Wars film in 1977 had a massive problem that nearly derailed the iconic duel between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader, and that problem was that they were incredibly fragile and would break apart almost every single time the actors tried to make contact with them during fight scenes. These early props were essentially bits of wood wrapped in foam projection material, and they simply couldn't withstand the force of two actors swinging them against each other the way a real sword fight would require. Stunt coordinator Peter Diamond, who was responsible for choreographing all the fight sequences in the film, found himself facing an impossible challenge because he needed to create a tense, dramatic lightsaber duel between Alec Guinness and David Prowse, but the props they were using would snap and shatter if the blades actually touched. Diamond later recalled that they broke so many blades during rehearsals that he had to completely rethink his approach to the entire fight sequence. His solution was to teach both Guinness and Prowse to stop their sword strokes, just short of making contact, pulling back at the last possible moment so the lightsaber rods would never actually hit each other during filming. When you watch the famous duel on the Death Star, what looks like intense lightsaber combat is actually carefully choreographed near misses, with the close proximity of the blades combined with optical effects added later in post-production, creating the illusion that the weapons were clashing together. This fragility issue was eventually solved in later films when the production team switched to sturdier carbon fiber props for The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, though even those more durable versions still had a frustrating tendency to break unexpectedly during filming. Fact 3. Korean animator did the glow effect. The glowing, humming lightsaber blades that became one of the most iconic visual effects in cinema history were actually created by a Korean animator named Nelson Shin, who worked at Daepati Freeling Enterprises, the same animation studio that produced the Pink Panther cartoons, yet he went completely uncredited for his groundbreaking work for decades after the film's release. Shin was working as an animator in the 1970s when his manager approached him and asked if he could animate the lightsaber effects for a live-action film, and after accepting the assignment, he received the footage and used a technique called rotoscoping to trace over the physical props frame by frame and add the distinctive colored glow. What makes Shin's contribution even more significant is that he didn't just execute someone else's vision, he actually suggested the specific look that made the lightsabers feel so unique and otherworldly. When the people from Lucasfilm showed him the footage, Shin explained to them that since a lightsaber is supposed to be made of light, the blade should look a little shaky and unstable, similar to how a fluorescent tube flickers and vibrates slightly when it's turned on. He recommended inserting one frame that was much lighter than the surrounding frames while printing the film on an optical printer, which would make the light appear to vibrate and pulse with energy. Shin also suggested adding a degosser sound on top of the other sound effects for the weapon, explaining that this magnetic field noise would be reminiscent of the electromagnetic forces at work. Born in North Korea and having defected to South Korea during the Korean War when he was just 12 years old, Shin later moved to the United States and brought his animation expertise to Star Wars, completing the entire lightsaber rotoscoping process in only 1 week. Fact 4. The sound came from broken equipment. The distinctive hum of the lightsaber, which has become one of the most recognizable sound effects in movie history, was created by sound designer Ben Burtt through a combination of two seemingly random mechanical noises that he discovered almost entirely by accident while searching for the perfect audio to represent this futuristic weapon. Burtt started with the low, steady hum of an idle film projector motor, which he remembered from his time working as a projectionist at the USC Cinema School, and he recorded that droning mechanical sound as the foundation for what would become the lightsaber's signature audio. The second component came about through complete happenstance when Burtt was working with a broken microphone cable that wasn't properly shielded, and this faulty equipment accidentally picked up the electrical interference and buzzing noise that was coming from the back of an old television picture tube. When Burtt mixed these two sounds together, combining the projector's low hum with the television's higher-pitched buzz and crackle, he created the bass tone that would define the lightsaber's presence in every scene. To make the sound even more dynamic and realistic, Burtt then took this combined audio and played it through speakers while recording it with a microphone that he physically moved around in different directions, which created the Doppler shift effect that mimics how a sound source changes pitch when it moves toward or away from you. This technique gave the lightsaber that characteristic swooshing quality whenever characters swung their weapons through the air, making the sound feel like it was actually following the movement of the blade on screen and adding another layer of believability to this completely fictional technology. Fact 5. Vader's blade changed color mid-production. When Star Wars was actually being filmed in 1977, all of the lightsaber props looked exactly the same during production, and there was originally no plan whatsoever to make Darth Vader's weapon visually distinct from the lightsabers used by the Jedi characters like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker. The physical props themselves only had minor cosmetic differences in their hilts, with Vader's featuring black styling to match his dark armor, but the blades were all identical reflective rods that would be enhanced with special effects later on. It wasn't until the film moved into post-production and the rotoscoping phase began that director George Lucas made the creative decision to use color as a way to further differentiate the characters and make it easier for audiences to instantly recognize who was fighting whom during the lightsaber duels. Lucas determined that giving different colored blades to different characters would add another layer of visual storytelling, and this is when he specifically chose to give Vader a red blade to emphasize his role as the villain and create a stark contrast with the blue and green sabers carried by the heroic Jedi. This decision to use red for the Sith and darker characters became such an integral part of Star Wars mythology that it's hard to imagine the franchise any other way, but it's fascinating to know that this iconic visual distinction was essentially an afterthought that came about during the editing process rather than something that was planned from the very beginning. The concept of color-coding lightsabers based on a character's alignment with the light or dark side of the Force became so powerful and effective that it carried through to all subsequent Star Wars films and established a visual language that fans instantly understand. Fact 6. The blades were actually rotating wooden rods. The glowing lightsaber blades that audiences saw in the original Star Wars film weren't created through any kind of advanced special effects magic during filming, but were instead simple wooden dowels that had been coated with a special reflective material called Scotchlite, which is the exact same retro-reflective substance that's used on highway signs and road markers to make them visible at night. This Scotchlite material is covered with millions of tiny glass beads that have the unique property of reflecting light directly back toward its source, which is why road signs shine so brightly when car headlights hit them, and the prop makers realized they could use this same effect to create the appearance of glowing energy blades on camera. The crew would shine bright spotlights directly onto these reflective wooden rods during filming, and the Scotchlite coating would bounce that light straight back toward the camera lens, creating an intense glow that made the dowels appear to be luminous weapons, even though they were just pieces of wood wrapped in reflective tape. What made this technique even more complicated was that these wooden rods actually had to be rotating continuously while the actors were performing their fight choreography, because the spinning motion helped maintain a consistent reflective surface and prevented any dark spots or shadows from appearing on the blade. The biggest limitation of this practical effect approach was that it was extremely dependent on the angle between the camera, the light source, and the rod itself, which meant that if the lightsaber moved out of a certain optimal position or orientation, it would suddenly stop glowing and just look like an ordinary rotating wooden pole on screen. Fact 7. A secret stuntman played Vader. For years, audiences believed that actor David Prowse was the one inside Darth Vader's costume, performing all of the character's movements and fight sequences. But the truth is that an Olympic fencer named Bob Anderson actually wore the iconic black armor and performed every single one of Vader's lightsaber duels in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, while Prowse got all the credit. Anderson was a champion fencer who had represented Great Britain at the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki and had won several combined services titles in the sport, making him the perfect choice to bring a level of authentic swordsmanship and fighting skill to Vader's combat scenes that Prowse simply couldn't provide. The secrecy around Anderson's involvement was so tightly maintained that it took years before the public even knew he existed in this role, and it wasn't until 1983 that Mark Hamill finally revealed the truth during an interview, saying that Bob Anderson was the man who actually did Vader's fighting, and that it had always been supposed to be a secret, but Hamill felt it wasn't fair anymore because Anderson worked so hard and deserved recognition. One of the biggest challenges Anderson faced was the significant height difference between himself and Prowse, since Anderson stood at 6 feet 1 inch tall, while Prowse towered at 6 feet 7 inches, which meant Anderson had to wear special platform shoes or lifts during filming, and the camera operators had to shoot from lower angles to make him appear taller and maintain the illusion that it was the same imposing figure inside the costume. Anderson also choreographed the lightsaber duels in addition to performing them, bringing his decades of fencing expertise to create the sword-fighting sequences that defined these iconic confrontations. Fact 8. The Return of Jedi prop was lost. In what has to be one of the most embarrassing mishaps in Star Wars production history, the original Darth Vader lightsaber prop that had been used in both A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back completely vanished sometime before filming began on Return of the Jedi, and nobody could figure out where it had gone or what happened to it. This missing prop had been built from the vintage MPP microflash camera flash unit, which was the distinctive British press camera attachment that gave Vader's weapon its unique look in the first two films, but when it came time to start shooting the third movie in the trilogy, the prop department discovered that this irreplaceable piece of movie history was simply nowhere to be found. Faced with this crisis, and needing to quickly create a replacement lightsaber for one of the most important characters in the film, the prop makers had to improvise and find an alternative solution that would look similar enough to maintain visual continuity with the previous movies. Their workaround was to modify a 3-cell Greyflex flash tube instead, which was actually the same type of vintage camera flash unit that had been used to create Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, and they did their best to dress it up and make it resemble the original MPP microflash design. This meant that Vader's lightsaber in Return of the Jedi was technically built from the same base component as his son's weapon, creating an unintentional connection between their lightsabers that the filmmakers never planned or intended. The substitute prop was crafted to be a look-alike that could pass for the original on screen, but dedicated Star Wars fans and prop enthusiasts have been able to spot the differences when examining the hilts closely in various scenes. Fact 9. Sold for record, breaking $3.6 million. In September of 2025, Darth Vader's actual screen-used lightsaber from The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi went up for auction and ended up selling for an absolutely staggering $3.65 million, officially making it the most expensive Star Wars prop ever sold at auction and breaking the previous record by a significant margin. This particular lightsaber was the primary dueling prop that had been wielded by both David Prowse and stunt performer Bob Anderson during the filming of those two movies, and it saw extensive use during some of the most memorable fight scenes in the entire original trilogy, including the iconic Cloud City duel where Vader reveals he's Luke's father and the climactic throne room battle in the Emperor's chamber. the prop showed clear signs of its hard work on set, with visible scratches, chips in the paint, and wear marks that proved this wasn't just a display piece, but an actual working prop that had been through intense action sequences. Before the auction began, the highest pre-sale absentee bid had already reached $1.2 million, which demonstrated just how much collectors valued this piece of cinema history. But once the live bidding started, the price quickly escalated through 31 total bids before reaching its final record-breaking amount. The previous record holder for the most expensive Star Wars prop was an X-Wing fighter miniature model that had been used in A New Hope, which sold in 2023 for $3.1 million, so Vader's lightsaber surpassed that by more than $500,000. The auction was facilitated by Prop Store, a company that specializes in entertainment memorabilia, and the lightsaber had emerged from a private collection where it had been kept for years. Fact 10. The blade orientation created problems. The reflective spinning rod technique that the production team used to try and create a glowing effect for the lightsaber blades during actual filming turned out to have a major flaw that nearly ruined some of the most important scenes in the movie. And that flaw was the fact that the entire effect was extremely dependent on getting the precise angle correct between the camera, the light source, and the rod itself. When everything was lined up perfectly and the rod was spinning at just the right orientation relative to the camera lens, the Scotchlite reflective material would bounce the light back beautifully and create that luminous glowing blade effect that the filmmakers were hoping for. But if the angle was even slightly off, or if the actors moved the lightsabers into certain positions during the choreography, the whole illusion would completely fall apart. This became a particularly serious problem during the climactic lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader on the Death Star, because as the two actors moved through their fight choreography and swung their weapons around, the rods would frequently end up at angles where they weren't reflecting the light properly anymore, and would just look like ordinary wooden dowels on camera instead of futuristic energy weapons. The production team quickly realized that this practical effect approach simply wasn't going to work reliably enough to use in the final film, which meant they had to abandon the idea of capturing the glow effect during filming and instead commit to adding all of the lightsaber blade effects later in post-production through the rotoscoping process. This decision actually gave them much more control over how the lightsabers looked and allowed them to maintain a consistent appearance throughout the entire duel regardless of how the actors moved or what angles the camera captured. Fact 11. Props used Allen bolts as blade mounts. When you watch Star Wars and see those brilliant glowing lightsaber blades cutting through the air during fight scenes, what you're actually looking at is completely different from what the actors were holding on set, because the real lightsaber props didn't have any kind of glowing energy blade at all, but instead had a simple Allen bolt sticking straight out of the top of the hilt. This Allen bolt served as a mounting point where the prop department could attach wooden rod blades during the choreographed fight sequences, giving the actors something physical and tangible to swing around and clash together while they performed their dueling moves for the camera. The wooden blades that were fitted onto these Allen bolts were specifically designed to be sturdy enough to withstand the impact of being hit against each other during the action scenes, which was essential for making the fight choreography look realistic and allowing the actors to complete their sword-fighting routines without constantly breaking the props. All of those incredible glowing effects that made the lightsabers look like weapons made of pure light were added much later during post-production through a combination of rotoscoping and optical effects, which meant that the actors were essentially performing elaborate sword fights with what amounted to wooden sticks mounted on metal hilts. This approach gave the visual effects artists complete control over the appearance of the blades and allowed them to add the distinctive colors and glow effects frame by frame without having to worry about technical limitations during filming. The Allen bolt mounting system was a practical solution that bridged the gap between what the actors needed to perform convincing fight choreography and what the audience would eventually see on screen as futuristic laser swords. Fact 12. Shin suggested the vibrating light effect. Nelson Shin didn't just execute the technical work of rotoscoping the lightsaber effects for Star Wars. He actually came up with specific creative suggestions that fundamentally shaped how these weapons would look and sound in the final film, contributions that went far beyond what anyone had asked him to do. When Shin was examining the footage and thinking about how to make the lightsabers feel authentic and believable as weapons made of pure energy, he came up with the idea of inserting one frame that was significantly lighter and brighter than all the surrounding frames, while printing the film on an optical printer, which would create a subtle pulsing or vibrating quality to the blade. This technique was inspired by his observation of how fluorescent tube lights don't produce a perfectly steady glow, but instead have a slight flicker and vibration to them because of the way the electrical current excites the gas inside the tube. And Shin reasoned that a lightsaber made of light energy would naturally have a similar unstable, living quality, rather than appearing as a static, solid object. The effect was subtle enough that most viewers wouldn't consciously notice it, but it added an organic feeling to the weapon that made it seem more real and dangerous. Shin also went beyond just the visual aspects and made suggestions about the sound design as well, specifically recommending that the sound team should add what's called a degausser sound on top of the other audio effects for the weapon. A degausser is a device that produces a strong magnetic field, and Shin explained that this particular type of electromagnetic noise would be reminiscent of the kind of energy fields that would theoretically be at work in a lightsaber, adding another layer of authenticity to something that was completely fictional. Fact 13. Greyflex logo. Visible on original props. One of the most amusing details about the original Star Wars lightsaber props is that many of them still have the Greyflex camera flash manufacturer logos clearly etched into the metal hilts, permanent markings that reveal these futuristic weapons from a galaxy far, far away were actually built from vintage photography equipment from the 1940s. When the prop makers were converting these old Greyflex camera flash handles into lightsabers, they either didn't bother to remove these logos or simply couldn't completely eliminate them without damaging the metal surface, so the company name and branding remained visible on the props throughout filming, and in many cases are still there to this day. These manufacturer markings are particularly noticeable on Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, which was built from a Greyflex flash handle just like Vader's replacement prop was, and if you look closely at certain angles during the movies or examine the props in person, you can actually see the Greyflex branding etched into what's supposed to be ancient Jedi technology. The logos have become a cherished detail among Star Wars prop collectors and enthusiasts because they serve as undeniable proof of a prop's authenticity and connection to the original films, making them valuable markers that help verify whether a particular lightsaber is a genuine screen-used piece or a replica. When these original props are displayed in museums or appear in private collections, the visible Greyflex logos are often highlighted as part of the exhibit because they tell the story of how these iconic weapons were created through resourcefulness and creative problem-solving, rather than big-budget special effects. For modern replica makers and fans who want to build their own screen-accurate lightsabers, these original manufacturer markings have become essential details to include, turning what was once just a practical oversight into an iconic feature. Fact 14. Different fighting philosophy for original trilogy. When George Lucas was developing the concept for lightsabers in the original Star Wars film, he had a very specific vision for how these weapons should work that was completely different from how they're portrayed in later movies, and that vision was based on the idea that lightsabers were incredibly heavy and difficult to handle, requiring users to grip them with both hands like medieval broadswords. Lucas wanted the fighting style to reflect this sense of weight and power, so he instructed stunt coordinator Peter Diamond to choreograph the duels with a broadsword dueling approach that incorporated elements of Japanese kendo, but kept all the moves as two-handed strokes rather than the quick, agile one-handed techniques that would appear in later films. This philosophy explains why the famous lightsaber duel between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi on the Death Star in A New Hope looks so measured, deliberate, and almost cautious compared to the fast-paced acrobatic battles that fans would see in The Phantom Menace or Revenge of the Sith decades later. Every movement in that original duel was performed with both hands firmly gripping the weapon, and the actors swung their lightsabers with the kind of careful, powerful strokes you would use if you were wielding a genuinely heavy blade that required significant strength and control to maneuver effectively. Lucas later changed his mind about this concept and decided to make the lightsaber combat faster and more intense for the sequels, explaining that he wanted to show Jedi in their prime and demonstrate what these weapons could really do in the hands of skilled warriors, which led to the evolution of increasingly athletic and elaborate fighting styles as the franchise progressed through The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and eventually the prequel trilogy. Fact 15. The whole process took just 1 week. What makes Nelson Shin's contribution to Star Wars even more remarkable is that when he accepted the assignment to create all of the lightsaber glow effects through rotoscoping, he managed to complete the entire painstaking process in just 1 week, a turnaround time that was so fast it actually surprised and impressed his own production company at DePatie Frelling Enterprises. Rotoscoping is an incredibly labor-intensive technique that requires an animator to trace over live-action footage frame by frame, which means Shin had to go through every single frame of every lightsaber scene in the movie and carefully draw the glowing blade effects by hand to create the illusion of these energy weapons. This wasn't a simple matter of just adding a solid color over the props, because Shin had to account for all the subtle movements, angle changes, and variations in how the lightsabers appeared throughout each shot, making sure the glow effects looked consistent and believable, while also incorporating his creative suggestions like the vibrating fluorescent tube quality that made the blades feel alive. The fact that he accomplished all of this work in such a compressed time frame speaks to both his exceptional skill as an animator and his deep understanding of the visual effect that Lucas and the Lucasfilm team were trying to achieve. When Lucasfilm received the completed work and saw what Shin had created in just 7 days, they were so pleased with the results that they followed his recommendations about using an X-Acto knife to give the lightsabers a very sharp, clean look and adding sound effects that would accompany the weapon's movements, implementing his vision almost exactly as he had suggested.